Hello, YouTubers, and welcome to Big Buddha is Watching. I'm Big Buddha. Now, for those of you who follow my channel, you might remember that around Christmas I reviewed The Last Jedi. A review that got some good notices, actually. I just recently rewatched it, the review that is, not the film, and I still stand by what I said in that review. I still think it's a great movie. I always had to recheck my thoughts after the critical backlash that film got, just to make sure I wasn't deluded in some way. And the review itself just reminded me. It's like, yeah, no, there was a lot of good stuff in that film, and so at least amongst the YouTube film review community, I'm going to be the one waving the flag for The Last Jedi from now forevermore, because I do really think that's a good sci-fi movie, a good movie in itself, and a good Star Wars movie. I can see why you might think that it's a little outside the box compared to the rest of the series, but that was one of the things I appreciated about it. It was it was good after 40 years. A film franchise can still pull the rug from under your feet. I equate it to something like Skyfall, really, where that was to all intents and purposes, it followed all the beats of a James Bond movie, but it was something fresh and original. It felt like artistically a different take on familiar material, and so why that film gets the pass and The Last Jedi didn't baffles me, really. But I'm not here to talk about The Last Jedi. The reason I just cite that up is that the fact that in that review I mentioned it was my intention to look at every Star Wars film to date between now and, well, probably the release of Episode 9. I certainly won't be able to do this all until between the release of Solo, which is coming out in a couple of months, which I probably will look at. But my intention is to look at periodically all the Star Wars films to date, and this is going to be a look at Episode 4, A New Hope, or Star Wars. I'm calling this review a review of Star Wars. It's not really going to be a review, because you don't need me to review Star Wars. If you've never seen Star Wars, what are you doing on this channel? This isn't the channel for you. If you watch my videos, I'm going to assume that you're a film fan to some extent, and really, I don't know how you can claim to be a film fan, or, well, a pop culture fan at the very least, if you've never seen Star Wars. So this is really going to be just a sort of free form critical analysis of A New Hope, and instead of just a straight up review, because like I say, everyone's seen Star Wars, everyone has their own opinion on it. I really can't add anything to the pot at this point when it comes to looking at Star Wars. And the reason I'm calling this a review of Star Wars instead of a Star Wars A New Hope or Star Wars Episode 4 is that I'm going to title these videos with their official release titles, which is something I'm very adamant about. Okay, and just before we get going, what I mean by that is that the three trilogies that we've had to date have all taken a different approach to the titling system. Okay, so just to briefly go over it, the original trilogy, i.e. episodes 4 to 6, their official titles are Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi. Okay, the prequel trilogy, their official titles are Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, and Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. The current trilogy that we're getting eschews the episode moniker, so they're just Star Wars The Force Awakens, Star Wars The Last Jedi, and whatever episode 9 is going to be called. Okay, so that's just a little tick with me, but that is something that I'm very adamant about, and that is how I'm going to be titling these videos. Okay. So, I mean, so like I say, everyone's seen Star Wars. Everyone's has an opinion of it. Everyone's watched other videos, in-depth critical analysis of the films to date. You know the films inside out. Hell, I mean, like me, if you've done media studies, you'll have analysed them. I think media studies lecturers will cite up something like Star Wars, at least to kids of my generation who did media studies when I did it, because it's a way in. Because it's a film and a franchise that everyone knows, and most people love. A media studies lecturer will, a clever way to engage the imagination is to uh, take something that people know and say, "Did you realise it's actually something else?" And one reading of Star Wars that I've heard more than once really is it's a western. Okay, I can see that. I can kind of see where they're coming from. Hero rides into town, or in this case, the Death Star. He rides into the place where evil has taken over, with the intent of defeating the bad guy and bringing justice to an unlawful society, and in the process wins the girl. He rounds up a posse who generally character archetypes, almost caricatures, if you like. The grizzled one who's seen it all, the wise old mentor, the cocksure, steady, smart shooter, and two or three sidekicks, and they ride into town with the intention of bringing justice. It's the Wild Bunch. It's for a few dollars more, a fistful of dollars. It's that story. I mean, yeah, okay, you can make that comparison. I've never really seen it. Well, I mean, I can see where it's coming from, but I think if you can compare it to that genre, I think you can. To me, the storytelling in Star Wars is far more universal. The reason Star Wars works so well is, it follows the quintessential story structure, of good versus evil, the hero defeating the villain, the hero getting the girl, and in that respect, a New Hope at least is, I see it more as a fairy tale. It's a fairy tale set in space. It's a fairy tale with laser guns, and it's far more of a universal story really than just your conventional Western in space, if you ask me. The film came out in 1977. It was George Lucas's third film as a director. It's only one of 6 films he's directed to date, 4 of which are Star Wars movies. He gave up directing after Star Wars, which I always cite as a shame, really, because I mean the reasoning behind it was that he was kind of a gawky, awkward person and not really a people person. He was more interested in storytelling and developing technology, and coming up with crazy notions and characters. But he was far happier at least through the 80s and most of the 90s, to hand the reins over to other filmmakers. I've always kind of seen that as his downfall, really, because although he wasn't much maligned, I think, at the time for his very one note directing style. The stories from the set that the actors tell, Carrie Fisher and Harrison Ford, about how they wanted to get T-shirts printed up that just said "faster and more intense" because that was the sum of his direction. The the cast would read his dialogue. He'd realise that how hokey it sounded, and so he'd tell them to do it faster and more intense. Hey, it worked because you really don't realise how hokey that dialogue is because it's delivered at such a breakneck speed by the cast throughout the film. That's it really it almost papers over the cracks in his direction. Um, and amazingly, I mean, it's a film that shouldn't have worked because a lot of it was papering over the cracks. There's a great documentary on the DVDs about the making of all the films, and if you see early rough cuts of some of the scenes in Star Wars, you before the special effects were added, which is obviously Lucas's strong suit. Um, it, you get the impression that if there's any part of the production process that he's most comfortable in, it's the post-production process, because the early rough cut of the film, everyone thought they had a turkey. If you watch the destruction of Alderaan scene, it is literally shots of the laser beam firing up and then just a title card that says bang. Very few directors are really that competent or that show offy in their early work. Even some of the greats, Tarantino is slowly starting to be considered as one of the greats when it comes to movie directors. But even though, yes, Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction and Jackie Brown are all great movies, they are almost amateurishly shot movies. It wasn't until Kill Bill and Inglourious Basterds and Django Unchained that Tarantino got very competent and more fluid in his direction. Dogs and Pulp Fiction are very stilted by comparison, and so I always thought it was a great shame that Lucas decided to bulk on directing, because directing it's like a muscle. If you don't exercise it, it shrivels up and becomes weak, and it's hard to. The longer you leave it, it's hard to regain that muscle memory, and when you do, you get a bit of a weak muscle, like the Phantom Menace, for example. Uh, People. The common consensus now is, oh, Lucas was a terrible director. Um, Empire Strikes Back is a far more competently directed film. Well, he was very hands-on as a producer with both Empire and Jedi, and I actually believe that had he been there calling the shots and working with the actors again, who would have been much more comfortable in their roles had he directed Empire, um, and working with that great script by Lawrence Kasdan, of course, from Lucas's story, I honestly believe you would have got a film just as good as Empire. I'd have been very intrigued to see Lucas, the Lucas who made A New Hope, direct Empire. I'd have been very intrigued to have seen his version of the Indiana Jones films, and Willow. Most of all, Howard the Duck. That's that. Had he directed that, well, I mean, he couldn't have done much worse, really. Um, his version of Radioland Murders as well is something I think that would have been a sight to behold. I'm happy he handed the reins over to Jim Henson for Labyrinth, but that was only ever Jim Henson's baby anyway. I think he just put his stamp of approval on it. Some people have careers where they just produce sublime work throughout, and for some people the bubble bursts through circumstances or the things that go on in the private life, whatever. But yeah, in the 70s, very much so. Lucas was shaping up to be a great director. THX is a very competently directed, well, competently directed for a first feature. American Graffiti is just is one of the great comedies. It's almost Altman-esque in how well shot and directed that is, and all right. He might have not had the best relationship with the actors in that film on the set as well, but it doesn't show. I think the nervousness of the actors actually, if anything, played into the awkwardness of capturing that teenage angst. So serendipity or whatever you want to call it really helped him inform his directing style in early on. But I believed if him, it's it was laziness on his part really that really let him down. And you could say that the prequel trilogy are really, that's what really lets them down as well. They're lazily shot. A couple of takes on the actors and very little direction. There's footage of him on set saying, "Yeah, I'm happy with the performances that he got there." Really, he was just happy that the shooting day was over and he could go and do what he wanted to do, really, which was just create animation and spice it in with live action footage, which is why the prequel saga really has almost a Roger Rabbit quality to it. I mentioned THX there because I think that's interesting, because that feels not at all. It's a science fiction movie, but you'd be hard pressed to guess that it was from the director of Star Wars, because that is Star Wars isn't science fiction; it's science fantasy. If it's close to anything, it's closest to probably the Tolkien, the Lord of the Rings. If episode 1 is the Hobbit, that's the fairy tale beginning. Episode 4 is the Hobbit, the fairy tale beginning. Then episodes 5 and 6, Empire and Jedi, are the Lord of the Rings. It's fleshing out the fairy tale to become a mythology. And that was done by very simple means, just by creating more depth and for the characters and upping the stakes. I think you can do that with a fairy tale beginning. It's interesting. I mean, it has fallen flat. I think Disney attempts it a lot by exploring the backstory of their villains in live action features, and it can't always work, but it can work. And Star Wars is the prime example, and The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings are the prime example of how you can flesh out a fairy tale story, something with very basic character archetypes, and make something more mature. And I think that's really something that's dogged Lucas's career, is that attempt to that sort of fine line he treads with trying to create simplistic storytelling and wanting to do something more mature and more artistically worthy. You could see that with the difference between episode 4 and episode 5 and episode 6, and indeed the difference between the episodes 4 to 6 and the prequel saga, which all of a sudden you go from a very simple fairy tale, good versus evil, to a, a a space opera. That's where it became. That's what it became with the prequel saga. It became a space opera. It became high drama. It became Dallas in space. Stories about taxation laws and trade federations and trade embargoes. So Lucas, I think these are the two sides of Lucas that that really wrestle with each other sometimes. His need to entertain and enthrall and take you to another world, and his need to be seen as a serious artist. And sorry, going back to THX, that you can see it there. There it was a very. He obviously has a very a love of science fiction as well, and very dark dystopian science fiction, something much more in the vein of 1984. Um, and Star Wars is the flip side of that. It's science fantasy. Lucas, believe it or not, he's the reason we have Apocalypse Now, because it's thought that if Star Wars hadn't been the monster hit that it had been, and Lucas had realised that the big money is in fantasy cinema and entertainment cinema. I think after Star Wars, he might have done Heart of Darkness, the Joseph Conrad story, and his career would have gone off in a very different direction to the one it did. He didn't do that, and he handed it over to his friend Francis Ford Coppola, who decided to shift the setting of Heart of Darkness from colonial Africa to modern era Vietnam. The Vietnam War had just ended, and we got Apocalypse Now out of that. So it's interesting to think that in another universe, George Lucas made Apocalypse Now, but he could have. The director who was working in the 1970s and creating these movies could have easily, I think, gone on to do something like Heart of Darkness afterwards, and I guess we'll never know what that would have been. I know that's a big influence on Lucas, as indeed any filmmaker of his generation, was Akira Kurosawa, and indeed the droids in episode 4 are based on a couple of characters from I believe the film's called The Golden Fortress or The Hidden Fortress. See the subtitles appearing at the bottom now. Correcting that fact. In that film, it's all told from the point of view of the two comic relief characters, really. In Star Wars, it's C3PO and R2D2, and the story really centres around them. You could argue that the story of episodes 1 to 6 really revolve around those characters. This film changed the course of cinema. I'm not even talking about popcorn cinema. Cinema as a whole. It was a bigger cataclysmic event. It was almost it had the same effect really on the history of cinema as World War II did on the history of the 20th century. It set it on a completely different course, and just cinema today, it would be a vastly different thing. We don't know what cinema would even be now if it wasn't for this one film, and the money. Because because it made so much money, it really showed how much money you could make with a single film or a film franchise, and so therefore, for the past 40 years, we've had endless attempts from everything to be the new Star Wars. Of course, nothing's ever quite achieved it. Uh, and I mean, let's not forget also, I don't know of a director working today who wouldn't hold their hands up and say that they weren't influenced by Star Wars to some extent. Even a worthy director like Chris Nolan, for example, will say yes, he was influenced by Star Wars as a kid. Who wasn't? So we don't know where cinema would be today. So what works so well about Star Wars? It, it is simple storytelling, but simple storytelling done really well. It's simplistic in its A to B hero goes on a mission, hero rescues the princess, hero defeats the bad guy. There's your three act structure, and I have to say, at least in episode 4 as well, the characters are they're not overly complex. They're character archetypes. I think where the Force Awakens fell down is, although it copied the beats of the story from A New Hope, it it shot its load too early by giving the characters greater depth than the characters had in episode 4. They weren't character archetypes. If you look at Han Solo in the first film, you really know nothing about him. He's a cocksure, lovable rogue, and that's all you find out about him at all. Obi-Wan's a very I mean, you find out a little about the Force, but you don't really find out much about his history and who he is as a character. He's your stock mentor character. He, C3PO, R2D2. I mean, they're just robots, and Chewbacca is just a funny-looking big hairy guy. Leia's the princess, and Luke Skywalker is the farm boy made good. That's all the characterization you get. With The Force Awakens, because they got Lawrence Kasdan in to write the script, he gave the characters a lot of depth from the get-go, and backstory, and put in a lot of intrigue for future installments. But that kind of didn't chide well with the very simplistic storytelling, the A to B storytelling of A New Hope, which is why that film feels less successful, really, because you're trying to give great depth to something that was only ever meant to be a fairy story. I mean, the Han Solo backstory is an uninspired idea, really, because there's not much of a character to explore there. So Solo is going to be an interesting one. I think there is potential there to make an entertaining movie. I've been a lot more behind the ideas than a lot of people, but I do see the argument that, yeah, Han Solo, as much as you love him and as much as you love Harrison Ford and how iconic he looks and how much fun the character is, he's not the most well-rounded character in the world, and so a Han Solo film centered entirely around him is more of a money making idea than something that immediately makes you go, oh, that's a good idea. I really wanted to know what that guy was like in his youth. I actually watched when I first watched the original trilogy. Should have been back in the late 80s. I actually saw them in reverse order, not through choice, that's just the way it happened. My neighbours had Return of the Jedi out on video. I went round to watch it. I'd never seen a Star Wars movie. Watched it, loved it. Then I saw Empire Strikes Back. I think I saw it most of it round at a friend's house first, and then I saw the whole thing round at the another friend's house. I realised that it's funny because I mean I had the toys before I'd actually seen the film, so I knew who Darth Vader was. I knew who Luke Skywalker was. But when I watched Return of the Jedi and Luke mentions that Darth Vader's his father, I thought, oh, that's interesting. They don't look much alike. And it wasn't until I saw the end of Jedi I realised, oh, he didn't know he was his father. That's interesting. So by the time I watched A New Hope, I actually made a conscientious decision that I wanted to watch it. So I went down to the video shop to rent it out. And so that was the last one I saw. And, loved it. I thought it was great fun. Really, really entertaining movie. It's about as entertaining as movies ever get. I've never really loved it as much as Empire and Jedi, I must admit. Also, I may put that down to the fact that I taped Empire and Jedi off the television and watched them on repeat. But Star Wars was A New Hope was never on, so I've seen that one a lot less. But I'd also put that down to the fact that there is just greater depth in the characterizations in and the mythologizing of the story is something I responded to much more rather than the very simplistic storytelling of Star Wars. So although Star Wars A New Hope is something that I've always found entertaining. I've never loved it. I love Empire. I love Return of the Jedi. And I think A New Hope is a great movie. It's really unsurpassed to this day. So there you go, folks. That's just a few thoughts on a movie everyone's seen and everyone loves. After 40 years of review and analysis, I know it's hard to bring anything new to the debate, but I just thought I'd throw my 2 cents worth in. I love Star Wars. I don't know many people who don't, and there's just a few thoughts on it. And join me for a later review. I'm not going to do these in order. I'm going to sort of dot about all over the place. So the next one, who knows? It could be The Phantom Menace, could be Empire, could be The Force Awakens. Don't know yet. Or maybe I'll do one of the offshoot films. We'll see. But until next time, folks, this is me, Big Buddha, signing off, and I shall see everyone out there.